Most people think commitment begins with action. They believe that if they work harder, wake up earlier, push longer, somehow the results will appear. But effort without direction is just motion. You can run fast in the wrong direction and still end up lost. Real commitment does not begin with what you do. It begins with why you do it. Because when the why is unclear, quitting always feels reasonable. We live in a world that celebrates outcomes. We celebrate the trophy, the paycheck, the followers, the applause. We are taught to chase results, not reasons. And so many people build their lives around goals that look impressive on the outside but feel empty on the inside. They say they want success, but they cannot explain what success actually means to them. They say they want discipline, but they have never decided what they are disciplined for. And when life becomes uncomfortable, when progress slows, when doubt creeps in, they ask the most dangerous question, is this really worth it? The problem is not that the journey is hard. The problem is that the purpose is weak. You see, when your goal is built only on external rewards, your commitment is conditional. You are committed as long as it feels good, as long as people notice, as long as results come quickly. But the moment the reward disappears, the effort disappears with it. Because you were never committed to a cause. You were committed to a feeling. Purpose works differently. Purpose does not depend on applause. Purpose does not negotiate with discomfort. Purpose does not require perfect conditions. Purpose is not something you do. It is something you believe. When your actions are rooted in belief, quitting no longer feels like rest. It feels like betrayal, not of a goal, but of yourself. That is what I'll do it or die truly means. It does not mean obsession with success at any cost. It means that living without your purpose would be a kind of death. It means choosing a life of meaning over a life of convenience. It means understanding that the greatest tragedy is not failure. The greatest tragedy is never becoming who you were capable of becoming. Think about the moments in your life when you have been most resilient. The times when you kept going, even when you were tired, even when no one was watching, even when the results were invisible. In those moments, you were not driven by discipline alone. You were driven by something deeper. You were driven by a reason that mattered to you, a reason that felt bigger than your comfort, because people can endure almost anything when they understand why they are enduring it. Pain becomes temporary when purpose is permanent. Struggle becomes meaningful when it is connected to something that matters. Without that connection, every obstacle feels like a warning sign. With it, every obstacle becomes a test of commitment. Most people don't fail because they lack talent. They fail because they never took the time to define what they stand for. They chase goals they borrowed from other people. They pursue lives that look good on social media but feel empty in real life. And deep down, they know something is missing. They are busy, but they are not fulfilled. They are moving, but they are not aligned. Alignment is what happens when what you do matches why you exist. When you are aligned, discipline is no longer something you force. It becomes something you express. You no longer ask, how do I stay motivated? You ask, how could I stop? Because you are no longer chasing an outcome. You are protecting an identity. Identity is more powerful than desire. Desire says, I want this. Identity says, this is who I am. When you decide who you are, your behavior follows naturally. You do not need motivation to be honest. You do not need reminders to breathe. You do not need willpower to be yourself. So the question is not what you want to achieve. The real question is who you are willing to become. If you want to build something meaningful, if you want to create a life that you can respect, you must start with the why, not the goal, not the plan, not the strategy, the belief. Why does this matter to you? Why does this challenge exist in your life? Why are you unwilling to walk away from this? And be honest. Because a borrowed purpose will never carry you through personal pain. Your why cannot be something that impresses others. It has to be something that sustains you when no one is impressed. It has to be something that holds you steady when results are slow and progress is invisible. Because there will be days when the work feels heavy. There will be nights when doubt feels louder than confidence. There will be moments when quitting feels logical. And on those days, talent will not save you, motivation will not save you, even discipline will struggle. Only belief will save you. Belief is what allows you to say, I don't know how yet, but I will figure it out. Belief is what allows you to say, this is bigger than my comfort. Belief is what allows you to say, I will not walk away from who I am becoming. That is the foundation of real commitment. I'll do it or die is not a statement of intensity. It is a statement of identity. It is the decision that your purpose is not optional, that your growth is not a side project, that your life is not something you postpone. It means you no longer measure success only by what you gain. You measure it by who you refuse to become. You refuse to become someone who settles. You refuse to become someone who quits when it gets hard. You refuse to become someone who trades meaning for comfort. Because at the end of your life, no one will ask how busy you were. They will ask what you stood for. And if you never defined what you stood for, you will spend your life standing in nothing. Purpose gives your struggle direction. Purpose gives your pain context. Purpose gives your effort dignity. When you know why you are here, even the hardest days carry meaning. Even failure becomes feedback. Even setbacks become part of the story you are proud to tell. But when you do not know why you are here, even success feels empty. You reach goals and feel nothing. You collect achievements and still feel incomplete. Because without purpose, progress has no soul. So before you demand more from your actions, demand more from your beliefs. Ask yourself the question most people avoid. What is the reason I am unwilling to walk away from this life? Not what you want, not what you hope for, not what looks good to others, but what you believe. Because the moment your actions are anchored to belief, you stop living on the surface of life. You begin living with intention. You stop saying, I'll try. You start saying, this is who I am. And when that happens, something remarkable changes. You no longer need permission to be disciplined. You no longer need applause to be consistent. You no longer need certainty to move forward. You move because not moving would be a betrayal of your purpose. That is what it means to start with your why, not to chase success, not to prove something to others, but to honor who you are meant to be. And when your life is built on that foundation, I'll do it or die is no longer a slogan. It is a way of living. Comfort is seductive. It whispers that, you have done enough, that you deserve a break, that tomorrow will be a better day to push. Comfort never shouts. It never demands. It simply invites you to stay where you are. And most people accept the invitation without even realizing what they are giving up. We are taught to seek comfort as if it were the highest reward in life. We design our days around convenience. We structure our routines to avoid discomfort. We celebrate ease as if it were the same thing as happiness. But comfort does not build character. It does not expand capacity. It does not reveal what you are capable of becoming. Comfort preserves who you are. Growth requires you to leave that behind. Every meaningful transformation in life begins the moment you choose what matters over what feels easy. That is the true test of commitment. It is not measured by what you do when things are exciting. It is revealed by what you do when things are difficult. It is not proven in moments of clarity. It is proven in moments of resistance, because resistance is where comfort fights back. There will always be a version of you that wants the reward without the responsibility, the outcome without the sacrifice, the change without the discomfort. That voice is not your enemy. It is human, but it cannot be the one in control. If you allow comfort to be your compass, your life will shrink to the size of your fears. Comfort keeps you in what is familiar, even when what is familiar no longer serves you. It convinces you. That stability is the same as progress. It tells you that avoiding pain is the same as protecting yourself. But avoiding pain also means avoiding growth. And over time, what you call safety becomes the very thing that limits you. You do not grow in places where nothing challenges you. You do not discover strength in environments that never test you. You do not find meaning in a life designed only to feel good. Meaning is found in what costs you something. The most fulfilled people are not the ones who live the easiest lives. They are the ones who chose what mattered, even when it was inconvenient, uncomfortable, and uncertain. They are the ones who said no to temporary ease in order to say yes to long-term purpose. Because purpose demands something from you. It demands discipline when you would rather rest. It demands courage when you would rather hide. It demands patience when you would rather quit. And that is why so many people admire meaningful lives but hesitate to build one. They want the result of purpose without the price of discomfort. But there is no shortcut. Every time you choose comfort over growth, you reinforce a dangerous belief that your ease is more important than your potential. You teach yourself that what feels good now matters more than what could matter forever. And slowly, quietly, your standards begin to fall. What once felt unacceptable becomes normal. What once challenged you becomes optional. Not because you became weaker, but because, you stopped choosing what mattered. Commitment is not built in dramatic moments. It is built in small, quiet decisions that no one else sees. It is built in the morning when you would rather stay in bed. It is built in the conversation you avoid because it is uncomfortable. It is built in the work you do when the reward is not immediate. These are not heroic moments. They are ordinary moments, but they shape extraordinary lives. Because each time you choose growth over comfort, you send a message to yourself. What I am becoming matters more than how I feel right now. And identity is formed through repetition. You do not wake up one day and suddenly become disciplined. You become disciplined by choosing the harder path often enough that it becomes who you are. You do not suddenly become courageous. You become courageous by acting despite fear until fear no longer decides for you. Discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a signal that something is changing. It is the body and the mind adapting to a new standard. It is the process of becoming. But most people interpret discomfort as danger. They mistake resistance for a warning instead of recognizing it as an invitation to rise to a higher version of themselves. Growth always asks you to leave something behind. Sometimes it is a habit. Sometimes it is a belief. Sometimes it is a version of yourself that feels safe but no longer fits. And letting go of what is familiar is rarely comfortable. But staying in what no longer fits is far more costly, because the greatest pain is not the pain of effort. It is the pain of regret. The regret of knowing you chose ease when you could have chosen meaning. The regret of knowing you stayed small because growing felt inconvenient. The regret of realizing that your comfort cost you your potential. When you say, "I'll do it or die," you are not declaring war on your well-being. You are declaring loyalty to what matters. You are choosing the long road over the easy road. You are choosing purpose over preference, and that choice will be tested. There will be days when you are tired, days when you feel unappreciated, days when progress is invisible. On those days, comfort will offer you an exit. It will say, "You've done enough." It will say, "No one would blame you for slowing down." It will say, "You deserve a break." And sometimes rest is necessary. But there is a difference between rest that restores and comfort that weakens. Rest prepares you to continue. Comfort convinces you to stop. The challenge is learning to recognize the difference. Growth does not require you to destroy yourself. It requires you to challenge yourself. It asks you to step into discomfort with intention, not recklessness. It asks you to endure what is difficult because it serves something meaningful, because what matters is rarely easy. Raising standards is uncomfortable. Changing identity is uncomfortable. Becoming who you are capable of being is uncomfortable, but discomfort is temporary. Identity is permanent. When you consistently choose what matters over what feels easy, something remarkable happens. Your tolerance for discomfort increases. What once felt impossible becomes manageable. What once felt hard becomes normal, not because the path becomes easier, but because you become stronger. You begin to trust yourself. You trust that you can face resistance without running. You trust that you can hold discipline even when motivation fades. You trust that you can choose long-term meaning over short-term relief. And that trust is the foundation of confidence. Confidence is not loud. It does not come from proving anything to others. It comes from keeping promises to yourself. It comes from knowing that when things get hard, you do not abandon your values. Every time you choose growth over comfort, you build integrity. And integrity is what allows you to look at yourself with respect. Because at the end of the day, the most important relationship you will ever have is the one you have with yourself. If you repeatedly choose ease over effort, you begin to doubt your own word. If you repeatedly choose comfort over commitment, you begin to question your own character. But when you consistently choose what matters, even when it is difficult, you build an unshakable sense of self. You become someone you can rely on. And that is what transforms lives, not talent, not luck, not even opportunity, but the quiet, relentless decision to prioritize purpose over comfort. You do not need to be fearless. You only need to be loyal to what matters. You do not need perfect conditions. You only need the willingness to act when conditions are imperfect, because waiting for comfort is another way of postponing your life. The world does not change because people waited until they felt ready. Lives do not transform because people chose what was easy. Greatness is not built in convenience, it is built in commitment. When you choose growth over comfort, you are choosing a future that demands more of you, but it also gives more to you, more meaning, more strength, more respect for who you are becoming. So when the moment comes, and it will, when you must decide between what feels good now and what will matter later, remember this: comfort will never ask you to grow. Purpose always will. And every time you choose what matters, you are not just moving forward. You are becoming someone you were meant to be. Most people believe change begins with behavior. They think that if they act differently long enough, they will eventually become different. So they try new habits, new routines, new strategies. They wake up early for a week. They work harder for a month. They promise themselves this time will be different. But when the pressure returns, when life becomes difficult again, they slip back into old patterns, not because they are weak, but because behavior alone cannot sustain transformation. Lasting change does not start with what you do. It starts with who you decide to be. You do not become disciplined by forcing discipline. You do not become courageous by pretending not to be afraid. You do not become focused by simply trying harder. You become disciplined when you decide, I am a disciplined person. You become courageous when you decide, I am someone who acts despite fear. You become focused when you decide, this is who I am regardless of how I feel. Identity comes before action. Every action you take is a reflection of the story you believe about yourself. If you believe you are inconsistent, you will behave inconsistently. If you believe you are not the kind of person who finishes what they start, you will find reasons to quit. Not because you lack ability, but because your actions are loyal to your identity. We do not act in alignment with our goals. We act in alignment with who we believe we are. That is why so many people struggle to change. They attempt to build new behaviors on top of an old identity. They try to become someone new while still thinking like someone old. And when the effort becomes difficult, the identity wins. Because identity is stronger than willpower. Willpower is temporary. It depends on mood, energy, and circumstance. Identity is stable. It does not ask how you feel today. It simply expresses who you are. You do not need willpower to be honest. You do not need motivation to protect what you believe in. You do not need reminders to be yourself. So when you say, I'll do it or die, you are not making a promise about effort. You are making a declaration about identity. You are not saying, I will try harder. You are saying, this is who I am now. And once identity shifts, behavior follows naturally. Think about the moments when you have changed something for good, not temporarily, not for a few weeks, but permanently. In those moments, you did not simply adopt a new habit. You adopted a new identity. You stopped seeing yourself as someone who sometimes did the right thing and started seeing yourself as someone who simply is that person. The most powerful form of change is not external. It is internal. You stop asking, what should I do? You start asking, who am I becoming? And the answer to that question shapes everything. If you see yourself as someone who quits when things get hard, you will always find a reason to stop. If you see yourself as someone who follows through, you will find a way to continue. If you see yourself as someone who settles, you will accept less than you are capable of. If you see yourself as someone who grows, you will seek challenges instead of avoiding them. Identity is the lens through which you interpret every experience. When something goes wrong, a person with a fragile identity says, this proves I can't. A person with a strong identity says, this is part of who I am becoming. The event is the same. The meaning is different. Why identity is not something you discover. It is something you decide. You decide what kind of person you are, and then you live in a way that proves it. Most people wait for evidence before they change their identity. They say, once I succeed, then I will believe in myself. But that is backwards. The belief must come first. You must decide who you are before the world can reflect it back to you. Because the world does not shape your identity. Your identity shapes how you move through the world. When you decide, I am someone who does not quit, you stop negotiating with resistance. You stop asking for permission from fear. You stop waiting to feel ready. You act not because it is easy, but because it is aligned with who you are. And when action is aligned with identity, it becomes sustainable. You no longer rely on motivation. You no longer depend on perfect conditions. You no longer need external validation. You move because not moving would be out of character. This is why identity must come before action, because without it, every habit is fragile. Every routine is temporary. Every burst of discipline eventually fades. But when behavior is rooted in identity, it becomes automatic. You do not wake up every day and decide whether to be yourself. You simply are. So the question is not, what do I want to achieve? The deeper question is, who do I choose to be? Do you choose to be someone who keeps promises to yourself? Do you choose to be someone who does the hard thing when it matters? Do you choose to be someone who grows even when it is uncomfortable? These are not outcomes. They are identities. And once you choose them, your actions begin to align. You stop asking, can I handle this? You start saying, this is what people like me do. People like me show up. People like me do not walk away when it gets difficult. People like me are responsible for who they become. This shift is subtle, but it is everything. Because when you act from identity, effort no longer feels like force. It feels like expression. You are not trying to become something. You are simply being who you decided to be. That is why some people remain consistent even when no one is watching. That is why some people hold standards even when it would be easier to compromise. It is not because they are stronger. It is because their identity is clear. They know who they are. And when you know who you are, external circumstances lose their power over your behavior. You do not change direction every time you feel discomfort. You do not abandon your values for short-term relief. You do not measure yourself by temporary results. You measure yourself by alignment. Are my actions aligned with who I say I am? If the answer is no, you do not make excuses. You make adjustments. Not because someone is watching, but because you are. Integrity is what happens when your actions match your identity, even in private. That is what builds self-respect. Self-respect ECT does not come from achievement alone. It comes from knowing that you live in accordance with your values. It comes from knowing that when faced with a choice between what is easy and what is right, you choose what reflects who you are. And when you live that way long enough, confidence becomes natural. Not the loud kind, not the performative kind, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing you can rely on yourself. Because you have proven over and over again that your word to yourself matters. That is the power of identity before action. When you say, I'll do it or die, you are not committing to a task. You are committing to a standard. You are saying, I refuse to live as someone who walks away from what matters. You are choosing to become a person for whom quitting is not an option. Not because it is forbidden, but because it is out of character. And that changes everything. The work may still be hard. The journey may still be long. The results may still take time. But your direction is no longer in question because you are no longer driven by what you want in the moment. You are guided by who you have chosen to be. And once identity is clear, action becomes inevitable. Not because it is easy, not because it is comfortable, but because it is you. That is how real transformation happens. Not by forcing behavior, not by chasing motivation, but by deciding at the deepest level who you are. And when you decide that, your life begins to follow. Fear has a bad reputation. We talk about it as if it were something to defeat, something to eliminate, something that stands in the way of success. We tell people to be fearless, to ignore their fear, to rise above it. But fear has never been the real problem. Fear is not what stops most people from becoming who they are capable of becoming. Fear is simply evidence that something matters. Indifference is the real danger. Fear appears when you care. It shows up when the outcome matters to you, when the risk is real, when the decision has weight. Fear is not the voice of weakness. It is the voice of significance. You do not feel fear about things that are meaningless to you. You feel fear when something important is at stake. And yet most people spend their lives trying to escape fear instead of understanding it. They avoid difficult conversations because they are uncomfortable. They avoid bold decisions because they are uncertain. They avoid meaningful challenges because they are afraid of failing. But in doing so, they are not choosing safety. They are choosing distance from what could have mattered. Because fear does not ask you to stop. It asks you to pay attention. Fear is a signal. It says this matters. It says this could change something. It says this is not ordinary. Indifference, on the other hand, says nothing. Indifference feels like comfort. It feels like neutrality. It feels like nothing at all. And that is exactly why it is so dangerous. When you become indifferent, you stop engaging, you stop caring, you stop growing. Fear can push you forward. Indifference keeps you where you are. The most tragic lives are not the ones filled with struggle. They are the ones filled with apathy. Lives where people stop asking questions, stop taking risks, stop caring enough to be afraid. Because when you no longer feel fear, it is often because you no longer feel invested. Think about the moments in your life when you felt fear most strongly. Starting something new, speaking up when it mattered, taking responsibility for something bigger than yourself. In every one of those moments, fear was present. Not because you were unprepared, but because you cared. You cared about the outcome. You cared about the impact. You cared about who you were becoming. Fear is not the opposite of courage. It is the companion of courage. Courage does not mean the absence of fear. It means moving forward despite it. And when you say, I'll do it or die, you are not declaring that you will never feel afraid. You are declaring that fear will not be the deciding factor in your life. You are choosing meaning over comfort, purpose over ease, engagement over indifference, because indifference is what happens when you stop believing that your actions matter. Indifference says, it doesn't really make a difference. Indifference says someone else will handle it. Indifference says, why bother? And once that voice takes hold, growth stops. You do not improve what you no longer care about. You do not protect what you no longer value. You do not fight for what you believe is insignificant. Indifference drains life of urgency. It replaces purpose with passivity. It convinces you that staying where you are is safer than becoming something more. But safe is not the same as alive. Fear means you are still alive to the possibility of something greater. Fear means you are still connected to a vision of who you could become. Fear means you have not given up on the idea that your choices matter. The problem is not that people feel fear. The problem is that they misinterpret it. They treat fear as a warning to retreat instead of a signal to reflect. They assume that discomfort means danger, that uncertainty means they are unqualified, that doubt means they should stop. But fear does not mean you are on the wrong path. Often it means you are on a meaningful one. Meaningful work carries risk. Meaningful relationships carry vulnerability. Meaningful lives carry uncertainty. If your life feels perfectly safe, perfectly predictable, perfectly comfortable, ask yourself what you have stopped caring about. Because the absence of fear is not always a sign of strength. Sometimes it is a sign of disengagement. Indifference is what happens when people stop believing in their own capacity to make a difference. When they begin to see their actions as insignificant, their voice as unnecessary, their effort as pointless. And once that belief takes hold, they withdraw. They shrink their world to what feels manageable. They stop reaching, stop questioning, stop striving, not because they are incapable, but because they no longer see the point. And that is the quiet death of potential. Fear says, this matters. Indifference says, nothing does. One of these pushes you to grow. The other convinces you to stay the same. When you choose to live by the principle, I'll do it or die, you are choosing to stay engaged with life. You are choosing to care even when caring is uncomfortable. You are choosing to remain vulnerable to the possibility of failure because you believe in the possibility of meaning. You are saying that you would rather feel fear than feel nothing. You would rather struggle for something important than coast through something empty. You would rather risk than retreat into apathy. And that choice changes how you experience everything. Failure becomes feedback instead of a verdict. Setbacks become part of the journey instead of a reason to stop. Doubt becomes a question to explore instead of a signal to quit. Because you are no longer trying to avoid fear. You are using it as a compass. Fear points to what you care about. Fear highlights what matters. Fear reveals the edges of your comfort zone and invites you to step beyond them, but only if you are willing to listen to it properly. The goal is not to eliminate fear. The goal is to prevent indifference. You do not need to be fearless to live a meaningful life. You need to be unwilling to become numb to your potential, numb to your responsibilities, numb to the impact you could have. Because once you become indifferent, you stop asking who you could be. You stop imagining what is possible. You stop demanding more from yourself. And the most dangerous moment in a person's life is not when they fail. It is when they stop caring whether they succeed. When you stop caring, you stop trying. When you stop trying, you stop becoming. When you stop becoming, you settle into a version of yourself that is smaller than what you are capable of. Fear would never allow that. Fear reminds you that something is still at stake. That is why fear can be a gift. It tells you that this choice matters. It tells you that this moment counts. It tells you that you are standing at the edge of growth. And growth always feels uncertain. The people who build meaningful lives are not those who feel less fear. They are the ones who refuse to let fear make their decisions. They acknowledge it, they respect it, but they do not obey it. They understand that fear is part of caring. They understand that caring is part of living. They understand that indifference is the real enemy, because a life without fear is not a life without struggle. It is often a life without significance. So when fear shows up in your life, do not ask, how do I get rid of this? Ask, why does this matter to me? And then decide Decide whether this is something worth caring about. Decide whether this is something worth committing to. Decide whether this is something worth becoming for. If the answer is yes, then fear is no longer a threat, becomes a companion on the journey. And when you choose to move forward anyway, you are not just proving that you are brave, you are proving that you are alive to your purpose. You are proving that you still care. You are proving that indifferent will not define your life. Because in the end, a meaningful life is not one without fear, it is one without apathy. One where you continue to care, continue to strive, continue to grow, even when it is uncomfortable. That is what I'll do it or die truly means. Not that you will never be afraid, but that you will never stop caring. Most people wait for motivation before they act. They wait to feel inspired, energized, confident, ready. They tell themselves that once the feeling arrives, they will begin. And sometimes it does arrive. For a day, for a week, for a moment, they start strong, they work harder, they commit publicly, they promise that this time is different. But then the feeling fades, life gets busy, progress slows, the excitement disappears, and without that emotional push, the effort begins to weaken. Not because the goal stopped mattering, but because the energy that once fueled it is gone. And when motivation leaves, so do most people. That is why motivation has never been enough. Motivation is emotional. It rises and falls. It depends on circumstances, mood, validation, and results. It is powerful in the beginning, but unreliable over time. You cannot build a meaningful life on something that changes with how you feel. Consistency is different. Consistency does not ask how you feel today. Consistency does not wait for the perfect moment. Consistency does not depend on excitement. Consistency is a decision. It is the quiet commitment to show up even when the work is boring, even when progress is invisible, even when no one is watching. It is the discipline to act when the emotional reward is absent. It is the practice of choosing what matters over what feels good in the moment. That is what I'll do it or die really demands. Not a burst of intensity, not a season of passion, but a long obedience to a clear purpose. Because greatness is not built in moments of motivation. It is built in habits of consistency. Most people overestimate what motivation can do in the short term and underestimate what consistency can do in the long term. They believe that if they could just feel inspired enough, everything would change. But inspiration is not what transforms lives. Repetition is. You do not become strong because you felt like training once. You do not become skilled because you were motivated for a week. You do not become disciplined because you had one good month. You become who you are through what you repeatedly do. Consistency is how identity is formed. Every time you show up when you do not feel like it, you are not just completing a task. You are reinforcing a belief about who you are. You are telling yourself, I am the kind of person who follows through. And that message, repeated over time, becomes part of your identity. Motivation says, I'll act when I feel ready. Consistency says, I act because this is who I am. One waits for emotion. The other is guided by principle. That is why consistency outlasts motivation. Motivation is reactive. It responds to circumstances. When things are going well, it rises. When things are hard, it fades. Consistency is proactive. It does not wait for circumstances to be ideal. It creates progress regardless of conditions. This is not about working endlessly or pushing without rest. It is about building a rhythm that you can sustain, a rhythm that does not depend on emotional highs, but on values, because values do not change with your mood. You do not need to feel inspired to live in alignment with what matters. You need to be willing to do the work when it is unglamorous, willing to continue when the results are delayed, willing to trust the process when the outcome is uncertain. That willingness is what separates those who start from those who finish. Most people are not defeated by obstacles. They are defeated by inconsistency. They show up powerfully one day and disappear the next. They move in bursts instead of building momentum. And without momentum, progress feels exhausting. Consistency creates momentum. It turns effort into habit. It turns discipline into identity. It turns small actions into significant change. When you show up every day, even in small ways, you remove the need for constant motivation. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop asking, do I feel like it today? You simply do what you said you would do. That is not rigidity. That is integrity. Integrity is keeping your word to yourself. Every time you rely on motivation alone, you make your progress conditional. You say, I will commit as long as it feels good. And the moment it stops feeling good, the commitment weakens. But when you rely on consistency, you make your progress unconditional. You say, I will act because this is what I stand for, and that changes everything. You no longer need a surge of emotion to begin. You no longer need external validation to continue. You no longer need perfect conditions to move forward. You move because your identity demands it. This is why people who build meaningful lives do not look extraordinary in the moment. They look ordinary. They show up. They do the work. They repeat. They trust that what they are building will compound over time. Because consistency compounds, small actions repeated daily create results that seem impossible in the beginning and inevitable in the end. What feels insignificant today becomes transformational tomorrow. But only if you continue. Motivation cannot carry you through the middle. Only consistency can. The middle is where most people stop. They start with excitement. They encounter resistance. They lose the feeling. They quit. Not because they failed, but because they were depending on emotion to sustain a decision that required discipline. I'll do it or die is not a statement of motivation. It is a statement of commitment. It is the understanding that what you are building matters too much to be left to how you feel on any given day. It is the choice to show up when you are tired, to continue when you are bored, to remain steady when you are discouraged, not because it is dramatic, but because it is necessary. Consistency is not glamorous. It is quiet. It happens in routines, in repetition, in the unremarkable moments that no one applauds. But those moments shape your life more than any burst of inspiration ever could, because life is not changed in peaks. It is shaped in patterns. The pattern of what you do when no one is watching, the pattern of how you respond when it is difficult, the pattern of whether you keep going when the excitement fades. Those patterns define who you become. Motivation may get you started. Consistency determines whether you finish, and finishing matters, not because of the outcome alone, but because of who you become in the process. A person who keeps promises, a person who can be trusted, a person who does not depend on emotion to do what is right. That kind of person does not need to be pushed. They move from principle. They do not ask, do I feel like it today? They ask, is this aligned with who I am? And if the answer is yes, they act. That is the power of consistency. It turns your values into behavior. It turns your intentions into reality. It turns your purpose into practice. Over time, it also changes how you see yourself. You begin to trust your own word. You begin to believe in your own follow through. You begin to identify as someone who does what they say they will do. That self-trust is rare and it is priceless. Because once you trust yourself, you no longer need to rely on emotional spikes to move forward. You know that even when it is hard, you will show up. Even when it is uncomfortable, you will continue. Even when it is slow, you will persist. Not because you are perfect, but because you are committed. This is not about perfection. It is about direction. Consistency does not mean you never fail. It means you do not let failure define your behavior. It means you return to the work again and again and again. Progress is not a straight line, but consistency keeps you moving forward, and over time, forward becomes far. So when you say, I'll do it or die, understand what you are really choosing. You are choosing a standard over a feeling. You are choosing a principle over a mood. You are choosing a life built on commitment, not convenience. You are choosing to become someone who does not depend on motivation to live with purpose, because motivation will come and go, excitement will rise and fall, feelings will change, but who you choose to be, can remain constant. And when your actions are guided by that identity, you do not need to be inspired to move forward. You simply do what you said you would do, every day, quietly, relentlessly. That is not just how goals are achieved. That is how character is built. That is how purpose becomes reality. That is how I'll do it or die stops being a phrase and becomes a way of life. In the end, this was never just about a goal. It was never about a title, a number, or an outcome. It was always about identity, about purpose, about the quiet decision to live a life that means something. When you choose your why, you give your life direction. When you choose growth over comfort, you give your life depth. When you decide who you are before you decide what you do, you give your actions meaning. When you refuse indifference and choose to care, even when it is uncomfortable, you give your life significance. And when you commit to consistency over motivation, you give your purpose the chance to become real. This is what I'll do it or die truly means. It does not mean recklessness. It does not mean perfection. It does not mean you will never feel fear, doubt, or exhaustion. It means you will not abandon who you are becoming. It means that when the work is hard, you will remember why it matters. When comfort calls, you will choose growth. When fear appears, you will recognize it as a sign that something important is at stake. When motivation fades, you will rely on consistency. And when the world gives you every excuse to quit, you will choose identity over convenience. Because at the end of your life, what will matter most is not what you accumulated, but what you stood for. You will not be remembered for the days you felt inspired. You will be shaped by the days you showed up anyway. You will not be defined by what you wanted. You will be defined by what you committed to. The greatest tragedy is not failing. The greatest tragedy is living a life that never demanded anything from you. You were not made for comfort alone. You were not designed to simply exist. You were meant to grow, to contribute, to become something more than what you were yesterday. And that requires a decision, not someday, not when it feels easier, not when conditions are perfect. Now, a decision about who you are, a decision about what you stand for, a decision about the life you are willing to live. When you decide that your purpose is not optional, that your growth is not negotiable, and that your values will guide your actions regardless of how you feel, you stop drifting through life. You begin to live with intention. You no longer chase success blindly. You build meaning deliberately. You no longer wait for permission to become who you are capable of becoming. Because you understand something most people never fully accept. A meaningful life is not found, it is chosen. Chosen in the small moments. Chosen in the hard moments. Chosen in the moments when quitting feels easier than continuing. So let this be the standard you live by, not as a slogan, not as a burst of emotion, but as a way of being. Choose purpose over comfort. Choose identity over excuses. Choose consistency over convenience. Choose to care when indifference would be easier, and when the road is long, when the effort is heavy, and when the outcome is uncertain. Remember this. You are not just chasing a result, you are becoming someone. And that is why you do not turn back. That is why you do not settle. That is why you move forward. Because this is who you are, and this is the life you have chosen to live. I'll do it, or I won't live as anything less than who I was meant to be.